Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock, and today I'm going to talk about checking astrological talismans against your natal chart. This is something that I do all the time for clients, either just because they're looking for talismans or as part of a natal reading, but I realize I don't have a video about it. It's also a really good example of how important unconscious models and automatic heuristics are. I find that I'm, as usual, because I got a big Aquarian side of my personality, seem to be always kind of trying to swim upstream against this massive flow of the way that people assume things are done, and then they get surprised because I'm doing stuff differently. And again, that's another thing to say about this is that there's not a right way to do this. There's not even really a consensus about it. There's starting to be this sort of modern approach that a lot of people take, but even then there's a lot of variations in it and there's no rules. So I want to emphasize that, really there's a lot of ways of approaching this. I'm going to explain my method. I'm going to talk about modern, not in any way really, attacking that. It's not the way I do it, but, that's fine. You have to find the way that resonates for you. So it's interesting because when you even mention checking the natal chart for talismans, of course, automatically that makes sense to modern astrologers or people that are sort of under the influence of modern astrology, which is most people, because modern astrology, it's natal, natal, natal. I mean, the natal chart is used for every single thing. So, for example, if you had the question, will I marry X, specific person, in medieval Renaissance astrology, you'd be looking at a horary question. When should I get married? Again, medieval Renaissance would use a lectional chart, but for modern astrology, it'd be natal, 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 natal. You'd always look at the natal chart. So if you're going to ask any specific information, get it out of the natal. Time for something, get it out of the natal. And so another sort of automatic assumption then, because it's all natal, is that, and I think this also a bit comes from it makes sense to people. I mean, I'm the center of the universe, is that your natal chart controls everything, not just for you, but the entire cosmos. So, for example, if you look at your natal chart and Saturn is in the 7th house, which is the house of relationships, then the assumption is, oh, well, that's great. Saturn is a good, love talisman for me. I mean, my chart determines everything. So, we really don't have an example of this in medieval Renaissance sources, but it's not really the medieval Renaissance approach to talismans. So rather than saying, oh yeah, well, let's look at the natal chart and wherever the planets are in the natal chart, that's going to determine what their effects are, what they do. The tendency in medieval Renaissance astrology is going to be to look at what we might call the natural rulership of the planet, or the sort of the natural, areas that it's involved with. And that's true for everybody. And that's also going to be true for if you're looking at planetary talismans, fixed star talismans, mansions of the moon. They all have a sort of fixed area that or effects that they, general stuff that they're kind of used for everybody, regardless of what the placement of the planet or fixed star, whatever's in the natal chart. So this is kind of my natural approach, and that's sort of my intuitive sense of it. And like I said, I haven't seen anything in a traditional chart they'll say look at the natal chart for elections particularly. There's really not anything in traditional sources about natal charts for talismans, except that when we get into house talismans, which is a little bit different. But anyhow, like I said, my tendency is to go with sort of the natural rulership. And again, I don't insist that that's right and that the modern approach is wrong. But I would say that the attraction to moderns of that approach is that it's, again, natally focused. So another issue that comes up with having this heavy natal focus is that the predictive nature of a celestial factor can be quite different from its effect as a talisman. So I think a classic example of this is Algol, whose predictive nature is malefic, but it's very effective as a protective talisman. So people will, see the negative predictive nature of it. And again, they're looking at natal charts. Natal charts are the be-all and end-all, as well as just being freaked out. The slightest negative thing, they're going to be like, oh, I better run away from that if I heard one negative thing about it. And also with Algol, there's a lot of misinformation or, just downright scare tactics as far as I'm concerned with Algol. So they look at Algol, they say, oh no, it looks bad in a natal chart, therefore it's bad, 100%. In fact, I did a whole video on this quite recently. When in fact, that negative energy is a predictive, ends up being outwardly expressed as a protective talisman. It's a very good protective talisman. And again, the enemy that's getting whatever they threw at you reflected right back at them is going to consider that algos malefic, but you're not going to think that. You're going to think it's really great, very helpful. So another issue that comes up in terms of the sort of natal-centric focus is synastry. Now, in modern astrology, like as I was saying, if instead of asking a horary question, will I marry X, if you're trying to find out about a specific relationship, the astrologer is going to try to somehow use natal charts. So what they'll do is they'll try to look at the natal charts of the couple, try to compare them, which is synastry. Now, how you do that, it doesn't seem to be a strict, accepted methodology for that. It's a kind of a random collection of looking at things back and forth. And even that synastry of looking at two people's charts has its limitations. What you're really getting is sort of their psychological interactions, not so much is this relationship going to work. I mean, people could have a lot of conflict but still be able to have a good relationship, or people could have a lot of chart factors in common and not be able to make a relationship work. So I have what I call a complete relationship reading, and that looks at both a horary chart to figure out, well, is this going to have a successful relationship, and then does look at the two charts and compare them to get a sense of their interactions. But those sense of interactions does not by any means lead to an understanding necessarily of yes, they're going to have a relationship or not. I mean, once you get yes, they're not going to have a relationship, or yes, they will, you can kind of see how those work out. But there's two different perspectives and two different things. So even when you're talking about human beings, that specific question is, of whether the relationship is going to work or not, is not something that's very easy to see or can be seen at all in a synastry in my experience. So then what people do is they're like, well, I want to know which talisman I should get. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my birth chart and I'm going to look at the talisman electional creation chart, and I'm going to compare those charts somehow. Now, like I said, don't seem to be any rules for how this is done, and I've got some really wild, for example, somebody said to me, well, if I combine my spouse's and mine's chart, then the midheaven is like the sextile algol, and that was supposed to mean something, be very significant to them. So it does seem to be a kind of random process, and whatever pops up, and there's no particular rhyme or reason to what the comparison is. But a deeper sort of problem with this comparing a talisman chart and a natal chart is that a talisman is not a human being. Talisman doesn't have friends and relatives. It doesn't have a family. It doesn't have children. It doesn't have a spouse. It doesn't have a career, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we're dealing with something quite different. And when you're doing an election for creating a talisman, for example, a planetary talisman, you're trying to intensify the energy or the power of that planet, and you're not looking at all the other houses. Now, again, this is another one of those areas that's controversial, and people are running around looking at houses. What's happening, though, is they're again focusing. Nobody is making a chart and looking at every single house and making sure it's unafflicted or something like that, because it's impossible. You have to focus. So what your preference is as far as your focus is going to vary. But again, a lot of this is just without any rules, without any sort of rhyme or reason. It's kind of made up as you go along. And my basic problem with the synastry, like I said, is that I don't see that it makes sense to be looking at a human being's chart and this talisman chart, because they're really two different things, and the houses really don't correspond at all. And then there's really no rhyme or reason to how they're looking at them. I think for the most part what people are doing is that they don't, they want to make a choice. They're not sure what they should choose, and they come up with a sort of, specious basis for it so they can feel better about it. When in fact it's not predictive and it's not something they can replicate. So, but again, that's just my opinion. I mean, people have all sorts of ways of doing this stuff. Go ahead by all means if you want to be, checking those two charts. That's something you can do. But just recognize that that's not the only way to do it, and that the other way is just because they're not yours are not wrong. I think that, there really is a lot of unconscious baggage that goes into this process. So I just kind of wanted to start out with some of that stuff and bring that out to the surface. And also, it's sort of like people just get befuddled with my methodology because they're again coming from this natal-centric approach, and that there could be any other way to do it just kind of surprises them, and it just doesn't seem right to them. That's, again, the reason for that is that's because they have a particular approach. My approach, what seems natural to me, is very different, and again, it's not because I'm special or whatever, it just springs from the approach I'm coming from. But because I'm in such a minority, I recognize, okay, this is my approach and this is the model I'm using, And these are the models that come from the natal centric. But anyhow, that's what I would say about it, is that as you're coming into this, recognize that there's a lot of different ways to approach it. Natal, that's fine. Now, it's interesting because my sense of, particularly with talismans, if we're getting into talking about talismans and natal charts, a lot of the approach that comes from the use of natal charts and talismans comes from the sort of popularized Vedic astrology. And again, I'm not an expert in Vedic astrology, and I'm sure there's much deeper, more intricate, rules and methodologies. But what you tend to see is a sort of jewelers, and they'll just, do a Vedic chart for you. And then what you get is, quote, astrological remedies, because people ask me about that, and again, I wasn't really sure what that meant, but that comes from Vedic astrology, and we're basically talking about different types of gemstones. And so what you do is you look at the chart, you see what's dignified and afflicted, and then you prescribe gemstones. And the gemstones are associated with different planets, the rulership or whatever. And so the power of these gemstones is coming from their natural power. I mean, it's like whatever ruby is, whatever planet rules that, it always is that way. You're supposed to have like a flawless, really expensive version of it. It's supposed to be the best, which I can understand why it's very nice for the jeweler, I suppose, to be trying to sell flawless gemstones. But they don't do much astrological timing of the creation or thing. They don't have designs on them. It's just a gemstone. I think that they do consecrate them at planetary hour. So that's a very different process from what the medieval Renaissance style is, which is again coming from probably from the Hieronymus Sabians and from Picatrix, which is that you're doing a full chart election. You're choosing multiple factors to make sure that that planet is at the height of their astrological auspiciousness and power. And then you're going to be doing images. You're creating like a picture or sigils or symbols or something like that at that particular time as you create the talisman. So very different process, but sort of the idea that, we should look at the natal chart and that will be the basis for what talismans we get comes from Vedic. So what people are tending to do is to come to me and say, here's my chart, what's the best talisman for me? And, kind of my reaction to that is like, well, that's like asking what's the best vacation for you. It's like, what are you trying to accomplish? What are your goals? Because it looks like that the medieval Renaissance astrology was much more goal-based. So, again, both sides are really dealing with the idea of the planets being afflicted or dignified. And so the Vedic seems to vary. Sometimes they'll say, well, you should have talismans of planets that are dignified. Sometimes they'll say planets that are afflicted are the ones you should get. So again, that's something that it seems like the planets that are afflicted is a little bit of a minority view. But again, that's something that people are looking at. And it's also something that I think it makes sense to me to look at the dignity or affliction of it, though what's dignified or afflicted is, again, people are going to vary on that. So you can essentially have, like I said, this Vedic, and it makes sense to modern people, a natal chart approach. Here's the natal chart, what should I get? Or, like I said, the medieval Renaissance, which is more the style I follow, is, okay, what are your goals? So you start out with the goals to say, well, I want love. And in that case, you'd be like, well, Venus is the talisman, the planetary talisman of love. Let's look at your chart and see where Venus is. And so that's kind of my approach, which is to say, okay, let's look at your goals. Let's look at the talismans, the planets, the fixed stars of mansions that fit those goals. And then of those, once you've figured out that fit the goal you want, let's see what's compatible with your natal chart. And so that's one approach. The other approach would be, look, I said, starting with the natal chart and somehow deciding, okay, what you need, or, your Saturn is strong, so we need to strengthen Saturn in some way, or weaken Saturn, whatever. I mean, there's all sorts of different approaches to it. So again, like I said, this is my personal approach. I think, which I'm going to lay out, I think it's in line with the traditional sources. Picatrix, they don't say much about it. I mean, there's a quote in there that says something to the effect of like, well, if the planet is strong in your chart, then you're going to have a good effect from it, which that's logical. I mean, the flip side of that would be if the planet's afflicted, then you're not going to have such a good effect from it. So, we've kind of had to run with that and try to figure out, again, this is my own methodology, lots of different ways of approaching it, but I thought it's worthwhile. I mean, I've been doing this for over 20 years, lots of experience, and like I said, it does seem to me to be in line with the traditional approach. So if we look at medieval Renaissance sources for most types of talismans, that's like planetary fixed star, mansion of the moon, deccan face talismans, the effects of that talisman are pretty universal for everybody. They're not going to vary depending on your natal chart. They're pretty much, this is what they do. Now, exactly what they're going to do, we'll talk about that a little later, impossible to predict. But Jupiter and Venus, like I said, is love. Jupiter is wealth. Sun is fame and authority, etc., etc. As opposed to this idea that if you had Saturn in the 10th, that just for you, Saturn switches into being a fame talisman, as opposed to Saturn's natural effect is he's solitary, so he's not really very good for being famous. So, I get the sense that the medieval Renaissance class, had this goal orientation, that they would go to the astrologer and say, I need wealth, or the astrologer would say, okay, let's see what we've got for wealth talismans. And then at that point, it would make sense to say, well, is this particular talisman for wealth compatible with your natal chart? So what I do, like I said, is to look at your chart and to see if the planet is essentially dignified, in which case I think that the talismans of that planet are going to be an excellent choice. If it's unafflicted, basically peregrine in your natal chart, then the talismans are fine. And if the planet is afflicted, then this indicates caution. Okay, and so again, I'm not saying it's instant disaster, which that's kind of the reason that, people afflicted, that sounds bad. That freaks me out. That sounds like, terrible things are going to happen. My experience is that talismans are always unpredictable in their effects. You're never going to be able to know exactly what's going to happen. And that the talismans of planets afflicted in natal chart are even more unpredictable. So I've certainly had people that had good effects from afflicted talismans. I had a guy who called me up. He got a Jupiter talisman, said, hey, this is so great. Got the talisman. And the first day I got the talisman, I got a new job. And I said, you know what, let's look at your natal chart. And his Jupiter was in Capricorn, which is in fall. So despite the fact that it's afflicted, he was able to get a good result from that. So most of the time, people don't want to have any risk of bad results, so they're going to stick with the planets that are dignified or afflicted. I have had students, advanced students, work with talismans of planets afflicted in the natal chart and say that they had problems, but report that they were spiritually useful. So let's just talk about what I consider to be dignified or afflicted. They have a very special and specific limited definition of dignified and afflicted just for talismans. Again, people are coming in from a natal approach. They start using all the knowledge from the natal chart and say, well, blah, 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 it's square this, strand trine that, all that sort of stuff. And I'm like, all I'm looking at is essential dignity. And I'm not looking at house placement, I'm not looking at aspects. This is just for talisman. Obviously in a predictive setting, it would be different. So if a planet in your natal chart is dignified by sign, exaltation, triplicity, term, or face, they're dignified, essentially, and therefore they're a good choice for talismans. My sense is the stronger the planet is in your natal chart, the easier connection you have with the planet. I mean, I kind of look at it as giving us, a sense of the sort of the preset relationship that you have with the planet. So again, if it's dignified, got a great relationship. It's like having that cousin you always love to hang out with, who's always so great, always helped you out. Dignified by sign. Peregrine, either dignified or afflicted, is fine for talismans. It's a bit like you have a weak, it's sort of like, if you think about energy, it's like your left arm, you need to work it out a little bit. So again, talismans are useful for that. You wouldn't probably get a strong result as from a dignified, but you could also make you strengthen it. Again, like relationship, it's like, well, you didn't get on well with them, don't have problems with them either, just sort of, it's okay. Now, afflicted is in detriment or fall, or retrograde without dignity, essential dignity, or combust without essential dignity. Those are what I consider to be afflicted. If those planets are in your natal chart are afflicted like that, in detriment or fall, retrograde, combust without essential dignity, then I'd say, yellow flag, so caution for that. Saturn is a special case. Picatrix says that Saturn, if he's dignified and retrograde, it's even worse. So I don't know, that sort of caught my attention. So with Saturn, I will say if he's retrograde, no matter whether he's dignified or not, that's also a yellow flag. So again, yellow flag, again, if you're super cautious, just avoid it. Otherwise, one of the things you could do is maybe do a divination. You could also do a paper talisman, see how it works. Those are less powerful, and you could potentially deconsecrate it more easily. Again, if the planet's afflicted, again, like I said, it's not instant disaster, just something to think about. Probably maybe I want to avoid it. I want to make some special effort or whatever like that. It's really up to you in terms of working with it. Fixed stars are pretty much fine for everybody. The only natal contraindication I use is if there's an afflicted planet right closely conjunct it. I mean, maybe the south node within 1 or 2 degrees, something like that. No other aspects other than conjunctions, and placement doesn't really matter, house placement. I haven't found that to be a problem. For mansions of the moon, again, my rule of thumb is if the moon is unafflicted, definitely if it's dignified, then, under those talisman conditions, then I would consider the mansions fine. If the moon's afflicted, and you want to know about a particular mansion, then you can do a divination like an I Ching or tarot or pendulum or something like that, and that'll give you and that's something you can do for any planet. It's interesting with that. I would say like 2/3 of the time, if the planet's afflicted and I do a divination, it tends to be like, yeah, no. Sometimes it can be really strong no. Other times it'll say it's okay, but it does seem to, the divination gives you a much more specific indication of it. And the thing that this kind of leads into is, people will then say, okay, so you're telling me that Jupiter's compatible, but you've got 5 different Jupiter talismans. Which is the best for me? And, it really would make clients happy, and I could probably sell more talismans if I'd say, oh, definitely get this one. I can tell, I can look at your chart, and this is definitely the best one for you. But I have to be honest and say that there's in my opinion, no way to tell whether a specific talisman is going to be better from your natal chart. Now, it comes from a couple things. First of all, there's no way to predict what the effects of the talisman are going to be. I mean, you just never know. I mean, it's probably going to be within the range of the normal rulership of the planet, right? But in terms of what's exactly going to happen to you, when it's going to happen, there's no way to predict. And it's certainly possible that there's no discernible effect. You just have to know that going in there. And so to give this sort of false assurance that somehow this is the best one, again, I mean, all of our talismans are powerful. I mean, you're not going to go wrong with any of them. So worrying about whether this one's better than that one, I mean, it's no point in doing that because there's no way to know. But again, if you want to go in, look at it and say, oh, look, it's, whatever, sesquiquadrate my, progressed Venus or whatever, so therefore that's good for me, that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with having a preference for your own method. The problem comes in when you insist that that's objectively true and, it's true for everybody. Just recognize there's a lot of different methods. For me, what I typically say to people is like, use your intuition. I mean, again, all of them are compatible. They're all going to be good choices for you. But if you like this particular talisman, and if your intuition says this particular one, that's the one I would go with. Again, divination, you can do the tarot, I Ching, pendulum, whatever methodology you want, and that's a good way to go through and make those choices. So really what I would say about this is that there's many, many different ways of prescribing talismans. And again, obviously I have my preference, I have strong opinions about it, but really when I get right down to it, there's a lot of different ways to do this. And so one problem that I've had is people will be like, assume that I'm coming from a modern natal approach and I'm following exactly what they are, even though there's many variations in how people do it. And they'll come in and say, hey, Chris, isn't it true X, Y, and Z? And then I'll say, well, you know what? I don't use that methodology. And it's certainly not wrong, but it's not something I can sign on to. And that gets people kind of upset, and they're kind of looking for me to say, yeah, you're great, everything's perfect, and that your methodology is great. What I would say is, look, if this is the methodology you use, have confidence in your methodology. It doesn't matter what anybody else does. If this is what you think is the best talisman for you, great. Go ahead and do that. Work with that one. On the other hand, if you want to know what my methodology is or what I would recommend, I'm happy to do that too. And so if you're serious about getting a talisman, and that's what I'd ask you to do is like, not just out of idle curiosity, but you're like, you know what, I'm going to buy one of these things. I just need to know which one. Then feel free to email me at renaissanceastrology.com. You can see there's email addresses in the comments part of that. Also, there's a bunch of links in there. There's a link to my page about choosing talismans that writes out in detail all the stuff I've been talking about, the various factors that I use for prescribing. And then also you can see our currently available talismans as well. But I think it's a very interesting issue from a practical standpoint. It's like, okay, I want to get a talisman. I want to do something. What would you recommend? And then, of course, recognizing that there's no way to predict exactly what the effects are. But then also recognizing that, all these unconscious assumptions and models that we have coming into this, and that, again, if you come from a modern perspective, you're going to have a particular approach, which, again, perfectly valid. Just recognize there's a lot of different ways of approaching it. And again, like I said, I tend to be out in left field with the stuff and doing my own thing. And I think it's useful to see how I do it. And then you can decide for yourself. Find the method that resonates for you, and then you can find the best talismans. But it's awesome, and incredible interest in the astrological community and talismans have sort of sprung up. Lots of different people doing lots of different things. And so that's what I'd say, sort of let 100 flowers grow that 100 schools contend. Everybody gets to find the way they do it, but it is kind of interesting to see how I do it since I've been at this for so long. So great. Hope you find that interesting. Check out our talismans at Renaissance Astrology. Have me check your natal chart if you're interested in getting a talisman. And good luck on exploring and have fun with this really fascinating area.